The last episode was the opening episode in this course of tribal sociology. In that episode, we accepted the meaning of tribe as referring to a band of people who live in remoter parts of the world. In this episode, we will go a little deeper into understanding the characteristics of tribal society. To begin with, we accept a definition of tribe. Tribe is social scientifically defined as a band or a horde of people who are living an isolated life away from the larger communities surrounding them wherever they are living in any geographical area of the world. In India, tribes are referred to as Adivasis, Adim Jatis, Janajatis, etc. All these terms basically refer to a band of people whose origin is unknown. For how long they have been living as a group in the remoter parts of India is also unknown. Robert Redfield came up with the concept of the little community. In his concept, Robert Redfield underlines 3 or 4 characteristics as very vital for the concept of the little community. Foremost, of course, in line with the way we have always seen these people living around us, is isolation. Isolation here means both physical isolation as well as socio-cultural isolation. These people who live in the so-called little community, as Robert Redfield calls, live away from the civilization, even to the extent of shying away from the people who are not like themselves. Go a little deeper into the concept of little community. The second important aspect is homogeneity. Partly because these people have been living an isolated life, there is very little chance of different elements coming into their ways of life. So, more or less they live a totally homogeneous community life. The third dimension that Robert Redfield emphasizes in his concept is the smallness. A little community is very small in size, sometimes not even extending beyond about 15 to 20 families, altogether about 50-60 people. Looking a little deeper into the structure and organization of a tribal community, what we have to note first and foremost as people who belong to the caste system in the larger civilization in our own country is the fact that a tribal community is not known for any kind of hierarchy, where every man, every adult, man or woman is identified as equal. In fact, there is very little that a growing child is kept away from in the routine way of life. There are, of course, functional specializations, people doing different things, but in complementary fashion. Besides the 3 points we highlighted as from Robert Redfield in the concept of the little community, that is isolation, smallness and homogeneity, one very important aspect of the little community life Robert Redfield emphasized is the pious attitude of the people. An average tribal is all the time afraid of a superhuman power guiding the life and spirit of community life. Whether he or she is able to know much deeper about the superhuman power, but the fear certainly remains in the minds of all members of the tribe, particularly the adults and the growing children. Let us go a little deeper into the structure and organization of tribal community. For us who come from the caste background, the first thing that should strike us in the structure and organization of tribal community is that there is no hierarchy. There is a prevailing egalitarianism among the people who live in the tribal community. It is not that everybody is doing everything. There is division and identification of who does what. There is good lot of complementarity. Different groups will be there within the tribal community, each group specializing in doing certain aspects of whatever is needed for everyday life. Let us now move on to the growth of population. Something very interesting in tribal life regarding growth of population, which will be amazing to an average student of sociology or average student of any branch of social science. We in the modern world are so much used to understanding the growth of population as the numbers increasing within a given village or a given town or a city. But the interesting thing about the tribal life is growth of population is not much more in the aspect of the number increasing within the community, but it will be more in the form of more and more settlements coming around. Like for instance, if the number of 15 to 20 families grows beyond a certain size, there will be a neighboring settlement that will come up instead of the people increasing the numbers within their own settlement. Something more interesting is, as the generations pass in the new communities, sometimes they become themselves so isolated between the two groups, two habitats, the two settlements that come up simultaneously. It is not that they are completely at loggerheads with each other, although sometimes the neighboring communities do fight with each other, but there is a lot of give and take between the two communities. The most unique example comes from the Polynesian islanders. There are 3 or 4 tribes that are living their isolated life, but there is an annual ceremony where all of them come together with their different food habits. They come together, cook together and have lot of fun for the annual program, although they do live their own isolated life as a routine otherwise. Isolated bands and hordes are the terms that are normally referred to as tribes. Basic emphasis is on isolation. Isolation is not always absolute, although we use the expression more or less isolated. In fact, left to themselves, tribes would love perhaps to be in total isolation, both physical and socio-cultural. But unfortunately for the tribal people, the civilized world around does not seem to leave them to live their own isolated life. There are always civilized people who come in contact with the tribal people whenever it suits their own needs, whenever it helps them to make a little more comfort for themselves. In fact, the lack of isolation or the reducing isolation of these bands and hordes comes not because of the tribal people themselves, but because of the civilized people getting in touch with them. Now, if you say that tribal people are living their own life, everybody doing something or the other, what is it that binds them together? To say that what binds them together is mutual usefulness may be to lose the very meaning of tribal life. In fact, it is the people who live in civilization who have mutual interaction based on usefulness. Tribal people live together perhaps because they do not know any other way of living together. Functional complementarity is something very, very vital in the structure of the tribal people. They come together, they work together. There are independent groups doing their own work, but independently interdependent, what modern sociologists came to call organic solidarity. Then there is homogeneity. There is some comparative way of how every adult thinks about everyday life. It is not that everybody is doing the same thing, but everybody thinks alike. Any adult, man or woman, who is asked about the meaning of good life would certainly give almost the same meaning what the other people are giving. This is about the growth of population. Now, when we look into the growth of civilization, you find a total contrast. Civilized way of life is what has come along in line with the emergence of the modern man. As I said earlier in this episode, In modern parlance, we understand growth of civilization in terms of more and more people coming into becoming members of any particular group or community or society that is living together. Growth of civilization by and large can be identified with the art of writing. In fact, art of writing has been identified as one of the most important aspects of modern civilization. We can easily understand why this should be so, because art of writing emphasizes the letter, the written word, and in perfect contrast, tribal people lived an oral tradition where there was no written word, there was no written language. So, that is therefore, art of writing brought in a total change in the way of life of the human communities. And besides art of writing, which recorded the ways of doing things, so that every succeeding generation need not start from scratch, they had a starting point, they could further build up. That made way for mechanical accessories. In fact, one can say that the Wright brothers did not produce the first aeroplane from nothing. There was something in the written form that earlier people had tried, and they could easily build on that. So, that is art of writing made way for a whole series of mechanical accessories that came into the life of the people. The interesting thing about the mechanical accessories is, when technology is used by human beings, there is much less personal direct interaction between the people who are using the technology. The most interesting and important example that can be given is today's computer. When a person sits in front of the PC, the person is not probably looking at anything other than the screen in front of him or her. That means, modern civilization has paved the way for impersonal dealing between the people. This is a very, very significant departure from the way of tribal life, which was personally interacting with each other. That was the vital part of tribal life. However, the modern accessories and the technological development paved way for expansion of human knowledge. Now, we have seen human knowledge has expanded by leaps and bounds. In fact, there is no single human being in the modern world who could say, I have mastered everything that is available in the world, because there is so much of an enormous amount of information now available to human beings. It is practically impossible for anyone to master any particular trade, particular profession. This is also in perfect contrast to the simplicity of tribal life, where people had very limited aspects of life to deal with. Now, simultaneous to this expansion of human knowledge and complications and complexities that came in the wake of civilized life, social organization also kept on changing. Earlier, we referred to mutual usefulness as an aspect. In fact, mutual usefulness is not an aspect of tribal life. Mutual usefulness is a very important aspect of modern life. In the social organization of modern life, therefore, where a person lives becomes more important than any other aspect of relationship. The most ready example from urban life is, on the one hand, you see the slum areas adjoining the multi-storied building. Those people who live in the slum areas have their own organization, and the people who live in the apartment complexes running into several floors also live their own organization. There, the people who live in the multi-storied buildings, relationship is not based on kinship, it is based on mutual utility for each other. They are together, they may form associations and groups, but everything is done with a purpose. Whereas, people living in tribal communities, or the ready example we had just now, that is the slum areas, again it is not on the basis of usefulness. There again they develop their proximity in personal relationship. Before closing the learning from this episode, let us recall the chief characteristics of tribal society. Foremost, tribal community is living in a well demarcated geographical territory. It could run into a few meters and around, or it could run into more than a kilometer or two. It depends on the size of the tribal community, but yet the basic aspect is that demarcation of geographical territory beyond which normally the tribal people do not go. It is not that they do not go at all, they go only for transaction with the neighboring tribes for their routine life. Another important aspect is that tribal people, as we know, live mostly in forests and hilly tracts. It is interesting to note that as modern people tried encroaching the areas where tribal people lived, it is known, at least in India, that the tribal people kept on moving deeper into the forest or higher up into the hilly tracts and the mountains, because the modern people started occupying the areas which were originally inhabited by the tribal people. Tribal people, as we have already noted, would shy away from the civilized people. It was not surprising that as the civilized people started encroaching the tribal areas, tribal people chose to go deeper into the forest or higher up in the hills and the mountains. Another important aspect of tribal life is that they have now remained relatively isolated or semi isolated. In fact, earlier on, couple of generations ago, they were totally isolated. Now we say relatively isolated or semi isolated, because as we just now observed, modern people keep encroaching, keep going to the tribal areas, because tribal areas almost as a rule are very rich in various natural products. The most important one readily coming to mind is the pure forest honey. There are instances that in the weekly markets, the civilized people would exchange just one packet of salt with a tribal man or woman who is ready to part with one full bottle of pure forest honey for the sake of one packet of salt. After all, salt is not what is available in the tribal areas, honey is available in plenty. There the value is not known to the tribal person, therefore, the modern people are able to take them for a ride in this kind of exchange. And after all, there is no money involved, use of money is almost unknown for the tribal people. They are so used to barter exchange. So, for them exchanging one pure bottle of honey for one packet of salt does not mean anything. Every tribe has its own unique culture, folklore and understanding of the cosmic life around, and they create their own belief system. But again, everything is in the oral tradition. They create it so uniquely for themselves. In fact, the diversity and uniqueness of the culture of tribal communities can be seen even when 2 or 3 neighboring tribes come together for some kind of annual fair. One can see the color and diversity of their uniqueness of folklore and cosmology and belief system. Economically, an average tribe is highly self-sufficient, not because they want to be self-sufficient, but because their needs are so very limited. There is no monetary system and there is barter exchange. They exchange whatever each one is making, either within the tribal community or with the neighboring tribal communities. There is no written language. In fact, it may not be quite right to use the word language, because in modern parlance the term language itself has been identified with a written script. An average tribal community revels in an oral tradition. Anything that can be taught to the younger generation is taught through the oral tradition by the elder generation. There is a unique political system with a chief. Most tribal communities are known with a chief directing them as to what can be done, what should be done, what cannot be done. Here I am reminded of one beautiful experience of a Zulu chief who was invited by Elizabeth to visit England. Queen Elizabeth had given directives to the entire police personnel to honor him, because the Zulu chief was to be driven in an open car from Heathrow Airport to Buckingham Palace. At every circle, he was stopped actually by the white police people with one left hand raised up and right hand showing horizontal, which actually meant to stop the Zulu chief from moving in his car towards the Buckingham Palace till the last white man across the circle passed through the circle. When he reached the Buckingham Palace, Queen Elizabeth asked, as usual, very customary question, how was the drive from the airport? Zulu chief was so very happy. He said, I am so very happy that I was honored at every circle, I was stopped and honored. And Queen Elizabeth knew what exactly had happened. She proved diplomatic, didn't probe further, but she understood. The secret was that lifting the left hand and keeping the right hand horizontally is the way every commoner among the Zulu people is supposed to honor the chief when he or she comes across the chief. And the Zulu chief thought that he was being honored, whereas Queen Elizabeth realized it was otherwise. This speaks of the cultural meaning that is given to the same behavior everywhere between any two groups, any two cultures, any two nationalities. The same behavior could be interpreted in a different way. So, every tribe has a unique political system, most of them by a tribal chief who seems to be a kind of know-all. He is the one who guides everybody within the tribe. There is a simple pragmatic relationship among the people. There is no stratification as such as we observed earlier. It is based on utter pragmatism for every day's life. Every problem is looked at pragmatically and solutions are sought readily for the particular situation or a particular problem. In contrast to an earlier observation that was made in this episode, that the modern people are the ones who go by mutual utility in their relationship, it will be hard to believe that tribal people go by simple pragmatic relationship. There is no rigid stratification. Every manner in which a particular problem is solved goes by a pragmatic approach to the situation. In fact, even marriages are said to be civil marriages among the tribal people, very much unlike the religious rituals that surround the marriages among the modern people, say in India. Every tribe has its own religion, gods and goddesses. It is not necessary that the gods and goddesses of tribal people must take the human form like we have known in the modern communities among ourselves in our country. Sometimes there could be simple piece of stone or simple piece of a metal, whatever is stuck to the ground, that is god or goddess for the tribal people. But then it is very important for them, and that is treated as god or goddess, and built around this god or goddess will be the stories as to how the whole thing came about to be identified as sacred. Most important in tribal life is the strong sense of belonging, that is the solidarity of the tribal people. No one tries to explain why I should listen to so and so. Wife does not explain why I should listen to the husband. People in general in the tribal community do not try to reason out why we should listen to the tribal chief, but we all belong to one group, and we have got to have that feeling of belonging to this group, and that is where the tribal community survives. As a tribal community, it has survived over generations mainly because of this strong sense of belonging. Before closing the learning in this episode, let me remind you that in the next episode we will go a little further in trying to understand the meaning of the tribe in the background of the caste system, which is much better known in our own country.